Welcome to this wonderful venue of the Leeds Art Gallery. MediaNorth is produced by volunteers. Nobody is paid to run it. There's a group of people who've got the talents and the conviction to produce it. It was set up, the first issue came out in December 2018, and it was set up after the organisation, the Campaign for Press and Broadcasting Freedom, closed its doors. But we felt in the north of England it was worth continuing, and I think that's been proven. When the election was called, we did Election Watch. You can buy copies of the full pack of Election Watch on the stall at the back. We did it without knowing how we would raise the money to do it. So we want you to help us by supporting us, by signing up to MediaNorth, by donating or taking a standing order out or whatever, because the issue of media reform in the new, ugly political situation we face ourselves in is going to become a top priority. That's why we've organised the conference. I hope it will be an informative, lively and stimulating day. The first session is one which has got Professor Dominic Wring and Justin Schlosberg. Dominic does, and is part of a team of people who've been doing it since 92? Yes. 92. Since 92, the Loughborough University Research Survey Group have looked at elections, media coverage. I think it's authoritative, I think it's impressive, and I think the job they do is a valuable public service contribution.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Granville. And thanks for inviting me. I first met Granville about 25 years ago in Huddersfield when you had a session there, and Nick Jones here, who's going to be speaking today, was talking about his recent work on spin doctors, and we haven't heard a lot about them ever since. And I often think about, what's changed since then, what's similar, and it was an inspiration, that event, and it's a great thing to be back here talking about a subject close to my heart. We've done, edited 3 books on the most recent campaigns, and we're in the process of doing another based on an event we had last week in London at Loughborough University's campus there. And we brought together a number of people who were involved in reporting and strategising and polling on the campaign, as well as a number of academics, and we've produced these books, Political Communication in Britain, after each campaign, and these have been, in fact, produced since 1979. But in terms of the Loughborough study, which I'm involved with, in terms of researching media analysis, this has been going since 1992. So we're in our 8th general election, and with the Fixed Term Parliament Act not doing quite its job, in the sense of, fixing a date when the election will be, we've been somewhat, kind of surprised, like everyone else, by some of the, rapidity in which these elections have taken place. But nonetheless, we've managed to carry on and do our work analysing, the major news bulletins. I mean, of course, this study started before Facebook came into existence, so we're kind of still looking at legacy media, broadcast and print. But other colleagues elsewhere in other institutions are doing work on social media and alternative news and digital and all these sorts of platforms. But we've stuck to the kind of mainstream media, the top 10 daily nationals and the major news bulletins. And I'm going to talk a bit about what we found in today's session. It's actually quite interesting doing real-time analysis. So we published 5 reports during the election, during the closing 5 weeks of the campaign. And so you can look at that if you wish on our blog. I'm going to talk to some of the key findings. I'm going to talk about balance in terms of 3 dimensions: stopwatch, directional and issue. And I'll go through those in turn as I come to them. It was interesting as well for us as a kind of research unit, being able to do some kind of real-time analysis, because we became part of the kind of media narrative as well, and attracted quite a lot of attention in this country, and indeed further afield as well. So, stopwatch. Who's getting access to the news, and interestingly, who isn't? There's broad parity in terms of Labour and Conservative spokespeople, the two obviously major parties coming out of the 2017 election. I mean, there Labour is achieving more attention in the press, and of course, as we'll see shortly, not a lot of it's favourable. But I think what's particularly noteworthy here about these figures are that the SNP, which is normally the third party in terms of its parliamentary representation, is somewhat down there and marginalised in print, but also to some extent in TV when you compare it to, say, the attention that's given to the Brexit Party and the Lib Dems. It's quite a noticeable thing that, whereas in 2015 when we did this exercise, you know, those columns for the SNP and then UKIP, the equivalent of Brexit, were quite a significant amount higher. And what about the leaders themselves, the key protagonists? This is the top 10 protagonists. No surprises, Johnson and Corbyn up there at the top by quite some significant way compared with other campaigns we've analysed. I mean, Ed Miliband and David Cameron were nowhere near as in the lead in 2015 compared to these two in this election. But again, what's noticeable, I think, on these statistics is Farage. You know, again, a party with any seats, and obviously only contested. I think it was about a third to a half or something in that region. Was the fifth most prominent person, way above Nicola Sturgeon, the leader of the third party in Parliament. And interestingly, the Greens, although there's a dual leadership of the Greens, they don't really feature, and yet they got significantly more support in this election than did the Brexit Party in the end. And I guess that is a reflection on a lot of the speculation about the Brexit Party and its stance and whether and how it would fight this election. We'll see a bit more about that later when we come on to look at the issues. And of course, as I've said, a lot of the commentary, a lot of the news about the leaders, Johnson and especially Corbyn, was not favourable. You can just make out there the Express and the Mail headlines about Corbyn, which were obviously quite critical of him and his stance on various policy stances and indeed his personality and his leadership, which is quite a feature of this campaign. And that obviously reflects the reality that most of the national newspapers are very hostile to Labour. We've done an analysis of this for several years. In fact, we've tried to go back to the 1918 campaign to look at press partisanship, where we think, and this is my colleague David Deacon and myself, we think that it's always important to kind of look beyond the headline of whether a party is supported by a given newspaper, you know, just the attribution of partisanship, Labour, Conservative, Liberal Democrat, whatever it is, to look at the strength. And we see here not a great change since 2017, but the Telegraph, for instance, is strengthening its support for Labour. The Guardian's somewhat weakening. And you see the Financial Times. I mean, some people call it as non-aligned, but in fact it did kind of make a point about the two main populist parties don't deserve our attention. But the main thing about this, I think, is that the Mail and the Sun still reach a significant, number of readers. Although overall we've seen a decline since the last election, that's only 2.5 years ago, of a quarter of the circulation. Nonetheless, 4.5 million sales, and obviously there are very many more people who read them beyond the 4.5 million who buy them. And of course also these newspaper discourses cut through into broadcast and other media environments as well in shaping discussion and understanding of things like elections. And in terms of looking at the balance, the ways in which the parties were reported, clearly the overwhelming trend is antagonism towards Labour, and that grows over the course of the campaign. And basically the pattern is from the first to the second to third, it increases and intensifies in negativity towards Labour. There is a small level of sympathy for the Conservatives in the blue columns, as you'll see when the image goes back, hopefully. But what's noticeable also is that there is some modest reporting of Brexit, Liberal Democrats and Greens. It is critical, highly critical of those parties, and particularly there's a campaign amongst the Conservative leading newspapers for the Brexit Party to stand down, which ultimately resonated to some extent because obviously strategically Farage withdrew his supporters, his candidates from those marginals where Conservatives were defending their seats. In terms of thinking about the election and the issues, I've got some figures about what was a significant subject in terms of the issue balance, the balance of issues. Where did newspapers and broadcasters kind of focus their attention in terms of news coverage? There was a significant interest in Brexit, no surprises. There was also some reflecting Labour's promotion of the health agenda. They wanted obviously to, in its words, save the NHS, and that was a significant issue in the campaign. The economy is inevitably is a subject of significance. But I think one of the striking things about this campaign, among other things, was when you compare it to, I've got some figures on public opinion and public attitudes, what are the main issues that are cutting through, is the relative marginalisation of massive significant issues. They used to call them the bread and butter subjects. Things like education is an issue to voters when they're asked by Ipsos Mori in polling. It's a significant issue, but it's barely there in our study. It's a very marginal concern. The environment's somewhat weighed down in terms of the media concern when you compare it to the public interest. And I think a really, really striking thing, which is absent from the discussion, and is of course for concern, is housing. Housing is registering amongst a significant group of particularly younger people as an issue of grave concern for obvious reasons, and it's barely registering at all in the study, which is quite interesting and significant. Okay, thank you. And hopefully we'll see it in a moment, but it registers in terms of the public interest in that particular subject, and especially amongst younger people, but it doesn't really cut through in terms of getting onto the news agenda. Another interesting thing about the study is comparing the media reporting to the parties' priorities. And all of the parties, with the exception of Labour, went heavily on Brexit. And the degree to which Labour didn't want to talk about Brexit is revealed when we followed their Twitter feed. And it was very noticeable that the party didn't really want to talk about it at all, but certainly a lot of other political parties did, to a large extent. However, when you talk about Brexit, interestingly, we did some analysis of news reporting of it in terms of looking at that as an issue and how it was portrayed. One significant thing, I think, is there's a lot of focus on Johnson's oven-ready deal, which obviously played well with his Get Brexit Done mantra. And there was some discussion of Remain and the possibility of a second referendum. But a really, really noteworthy thing, I think, looking back and retrospectively at the 2019 campaign, is the lack of attention to, you know, if Johnson's deal doesn't happen, harder. What, the full screen?
We get one in a second.
Yeah, lovely. The harder Brexit, which is now a realistic possibility. In fact, there could be a no deal in December. That's now seemingly on the cards. It was relatively absent from discussion. Yeah, I'll flick through. I'll use this to flick through, thank you. No, it's okay, I'll go through. That was just a commentary on some of that negative campaign, and this is earlier on in the campaign, Labour's Dirty Dozen. You might remember some of the candidates were featured widely in certain of the anti-Labour newspapers. That was a comparison between 2019 and 2017 in terms of the intensification of the negativity towards Labour. It's an indication of that. In fact, Theresa May got quite a bit of stick in 2017, albeit briefly in the campaign in the middle, but it mattered when she did her infamous U-turn. There wasn't a U-turn, of course. And then, as you can see, in 2019, that's far more significant, the pronounced negativity towards Labour. This is just looking at the voter profiles. When you look at the top there, that's the national results. And within 5% or thereabouts, there's not much difference when you look at the demographics in terms of gender and class. The really striking thing is age. You know, if you look at those age profiles, they differ quite markedly. The older voters, more pro-Tory, Labour, more younger, more pro-Labour. And I think that's why, you know, when you look at the press, it still matters, because obviously a lot of older voters are still reading, largely speaking, like, you know, people who read newspapers and watch a lot of television tend to be on the older side, perhaps more conservative. And things like this were quite prominent at the beginning of the campaign, the so-called working to man. And it's a particular kind of phrase, it's a particular kind of promotion of a concern about Brexit, about older white men demographic. This is in the Sun, but it was widely trailed in other media outlets, including the broadcasters. It's a particular constituency, a particular niche identity, but that really shaped the beginning of the campaign to make it, you know, obviously ever more about Brexit and other things. And this is what I was saying about the voter attitudes. Okay, Brexit's a big issue for older people, but there are other things: education, schools, as I said, housing, environment as well. But when you compare that to our study, what we found with TV and press, obviously Brexit's up there, but look, there's no education, there's no housing. It's down there, but it's in the other columns. It doesn't even rate a significant mention in and of itself. That's perhaps a surprising absence. Environment's there, but it's somewhat low down. Just looking and comparing how that maps to the parties themselves, these are the tweets from the parties we monitored through the final stages of the campaign. There, the Conservatives want this to be very much about Brexit, a little bit about taxation. Labour, trying to avoid the B word, talking about health. And the other parties, the Greens aren't on here, predictably they're a lot about environment, as you would probably imagine, but Labour were also quite big on that as well. And the SNP, that's not an issue here, but they're quite keen on devolution, obviously tied to the Brexit question and concern. There's a rare affinity between the Liberal Democrats and the Tories, and indeed the Brexit Party, on what was a key issue for them in this campaign. This is how it varied through the weeks of the analysis begin, the final 5 weeks up until election day itself. Brexit goes down the news agenda, and then it comes back with a gusto at the end. And then there are other issues, health, obviously that's Labour's key concern, cutting through there in some of the reporting. But of course it came back, the issue of Brexit, at the close of the campaign. And this is Boris Johnson at the JCB plant in Staffordshire with his famous talk call to emphasise that message. He's done various things like this. In fact, I don't think he'd done much else during the campaign other than you know, enunciate this slogan in different ways and in different places. And that very much obviously lined it up nicely for a close of poll message to the voters. And we looked, as I said, at the Brexit and the kind of reporting about Brexit, and it was very much around Johnson's deal, to some extent around the positions of Lib Dems and other Remain campaigners. But that second very small column is, I think, quite interesting and concerning, because, as I said, that potentially now is a serious alternative come the end of this year. The possibility of no deal, or perhaps a harder Brexit alternative. Who can say? We'll wait and see. And if you're interested in reading a bit more about the campaign, you can go online and find some further information. A group of us academics have put out a report which is free to download, PDF. There's our copy of it here. And it's, I think, under 100 people contributed. And if you know how academics work, they actually managed to write this before Christmas, which is saying something. And it covers all sorts of different aspects of the campaign. But there's a brief couple of reports by us in there, and you're welcome to look at them at your leisure. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dominic. Certainly the bar chart that stands out, that amazing red line, the bias against Labour that came through so strongly. Okay, by the way, when I arranged this conference, the first person I asked to speak was Dorothy Byrne, Head of News and Current Affairs at Channel 4. Dorothy was involved with the campaign for press and broadcasting freedom in the North West when she worked for World in Action. She was on our management committee. And she's really apologetic she couldn't be here today for personal reasons, and very genuine personal reasons. And I'm really pleased, therefore, that Justin has decided to stand in, by no means as a substitute, but as a very strong speaker. So, Justin, from the Media Reform Coalition, and I'm sure you could say some other things about yourself. Over to you, Justin.
Thank you very much, Granville. Thank you, Dominic, and for all the incredibly important and useful work that Loughborough has been doing for so long on election monitoring. It's interesting that I'm standing for Dorothy, because I think, with the greatest respect to Dorothy, I'm probably going to say something quite different to what she might have said. Particularly, what I want to talk about is what I think is the fundamental democratic deficit in our media system that was revealed probably more vividly in the most recent election campaign, certainly than I think in my conscious lifetime. And it is one that is not, I think, reducible to a simple overall left-wing or right-wing bias, notwithstanding the clear evidence of a very powerful, still very powerful and still predominantly right-wing national press. I think the overall systemic problem that we face is what we might consider an imbalance in favour of an establishment bias, or we might use the word a bias in favour of the centre. And by that I mean political reporters, including those at Channel 4, and certainly those at some of our most trusted and renowned, world-renowned news organisations, and I'm obviously thinking primarily here of the BBC, those correspondents who bear primary responsibility for determining the political news that matters at any given time, for defining and contextualising that news both for mass audiences and the wider media agenda, those who are granted special access within the inner ring of the lobby. These journalists tend to perceive and relate to political controversy through an ideological filter. But it is an ideological filter whose primary function, in a way, is to erase itself. That is, to erase ideology from the politics of the centre. And this is something that it actually has grown out of decades of, in many ways, academic thinking about ideology, going back to the work of liberal pluralists like Daniel Bell and Francis Fukuyama, who declared the fall of the Berlin Wall as the end of history and the end of ideology. And the substance of this narrative is that the fundamentals of Western economic liberalism are free of ideology, right? That is just what we might call common sense. But over the last 5 years, and particularly in the last election, what we've seen is that this self-erasing ideological filter has actually become increasingly visible. And that's really, I think, as a result of the breakdown in that liberal consensus framework that has shaped mainstream politics in this country and much of the democratic world for many decades. And it's probably most vividly symbolised here by the election of Jeremy Corbyn to the leadership of the Labour Party in 2015. And the way in which this disrupted and disoriented the, if you like, default position and ways of interpreting controversy by these journalists is that almost for the first time in their professional lifetimes, you had the problem of a leader of the mainstream political opposition who departed from and quite explicitly challenged that consensus, especially in the realm of economic policy, foreign policy, and indeed media policy. And this created quite a lot of confusion in newsrooms. Professional values, particularly at broadcasters like Channel 4 and the BBC, tend to dictate, actually, that whilst all political leaders should be subject to critical scrutiny and challenged by journalists, actually most of that antagonistic journalistic firepower that is popularly associated in recent history with the likes of Jeremy Paxman, most of that has tended to be actually reserved for incumbent prime ministers and governments. Of course, leaders of the opposition are also challenged, but historically, even when Labour has been in opposition, even under relatively left-leaning Labour leaders like David Miliband, even in those eras, there was still, on balance, in broadcasters, not talking about the press so much, a real focus of critical scrutiny on the Prime Minister and the government. Now there was a leader of opposition who appeared to be saying things that were so outrageous, so out of step with decades of conventional wisdom in political thinking, that these journalists almost seemed to have no alternative other than to respond with outrage. And that's how I want to suggest that this invisible filter started to come increasingly into view. And I want to talk about it specifically and practically in two areas. First is what we might call the deference to particular types of sources. Sources that are seen as instinctively perceived as credible, reliable, and authoritative by journalists, particularly within political parties, but also beyond that within the civil service and the deep state, officials and officialdom in particular. This deference actually resulted in some of the most egregious examples of disinformation and fake news circulating in the likes of the BBC and others. We've often become familiar with the phrase number 10 insiders. The use and deference towards number 10 insiders as sources of information, either through the lobby or other informal channels of access that journalists have, has resulted in, as Peter Oborne has shown quite comprehensively, this unprecedented litany of falsehoods surfacing not just on Twitter, but indeed on some of the main news bulletins that attract the biggest news audiences compared to any platform. We often hear this phrase, senior Tories or senior Labour MPs. A classic example in the election campaign was the story that ran about senior Tory MPs say that senior Tories say that an MP was assaulted by a Labour activist, when in fact it very quickly materialised, the video quickly materialised, showing that no such assault took place. And also we're very familiar with, particularly in regards to Labour sources, with the use of this label moderates. This deference to the particular types of what we might call establishment political sources led inevitably to an association between Corbynism, or the politics of the left of the Labour Party, with extremism. It fed on and fueled a threat narrative that actually began in the week Jeremy Corbyn was first elected to leader of the party, when both David Cameron, then Prime Minister, and George Osborne, then Chancellor, the two most powerful figures within government, both penned editorials in Murdoch-controlled newspapers, Cameron in the Times, Osborne in the Sun, maybe vice versa. Both of them saying exactly the same thing. The election of Jeremy Corbyn to the leader of the Labour Party represents a profound threat to national security. But this was the start of this narrative that we saw develop in all sorts of ways and in all sorts of issues, that Labour now under Jeremy Corbyn was a serious threat to not just to the economy but to security. It ties together all those stories about Corbyn's refusal to push the button, being a Putin sympathiser or a Soviet stooge, a friend of Islamist and IRA terrorists, and of course, being an anti-Semite. The common underlying thread is that Corbyn and those who support him are extremists. Now, this deference to these kinds of sources is very similar to the way that journalists have historically treated sources within the civil service and the deep state, especially police and security services. And what we've also seen over the last 5 years is an unprecedented rate of negative stories about Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party that are sourced primarily from sources active within the civil service. That's something that, again, is quite a radical departure from patterns in coverage of, for example, Ed Miliband. A study by Declassified UK found that deep state officials in the security establishment were the primary sources for at least 34 major national news stories over that period since 2015 that cast Jeremy Corbyn as a danger to UK security. That's equivalent to one headline almost every 6 weeks since he became leader. This resulted in a constant framing of not just Jeremy Corbyn, but virtually the entire Labour membership that had given his mandate to lead the party as hardcore militant extremists that were contrasted routinely with the moderate, Blairite, centrist wing of the party. This was a tacit and classic inversion of what Tariq Ali famously called the extreme centre. So even when these Labour MPs, so-called moderate Labour MPs, were openly waging war on the leadership, screaming abuse at him in public, in constant briefings to the press, attempting to oust him repeatedly through orchestrated coups, these MPs, who by their actions, and I should add by their policies, including support for unending austerity, unending war in the Middle East, wholesale rejection of the EU referendum result, persistent inaction on climate emergency, both in their actions and in their policies, these moderate MPs could just as easily and at least as legitimately be framed as the extremists or the extremist wing of the Labour Party. I just wanted to see, I don't know if this will work, if I could just give you an example of this. This is going back to 2016.
Outside, people may feel they have big worries, but this is a fight only one side can win. The others face being carted off to rebellions, the best for political losers. From the RBC's Westminster.
So you'll know the not, I'm sure, unintentional selection of the shot there of the garbage truck that happened to have the name Corbyn on it, as he talked about the politics of losers. I mean, elsewhere in that report, he repeatedly refers to Corbyn supporters as hardcore militants, uncompromising, that Corbyn had been reared in this political legacy of militancy. And really this was the subtext of the scandal embroiling the Labour Party at the time, which, by the way, was centred on an orchestrated coup by so-called moderate MPs. But the really important point to stress here is that this deference to those who are perceived as moderate, authoritative, trustworthy sources in both the political and security establishment accounted for rampant disinformation, often repeated and amplified by both BBC and Guardian journalists. I'll try and give you another example. This is in relation to the controversy surrounding the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which dominated or saturated headlines throughout much of the summer of 2018 and really cemented this narrative that Jeremy Corbyn was, if not tolerant or actively, if not tolerant of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, was actively complicit in it. So the key thing to emphasise here is the context of the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism is that since its original formulation as part of the EU monitoring group on racism many, many years ago, has been mired in controversy. It has been rejected, for instance, by dozens of Jewish organisations around the world who, at the time of this controversy, published a letter, an open letter, voicing their opposition to it. Not to mention Palestinian groups, other main minority groups, not to mention leading QCs. There were three legal QC opinions given on the definition, again around this time, which castigated it as wholly unfit for purpose in any form of formal code of conduct. It was also, by the way, rejected by the majority of local authorities in this country, who were requested by central government back in 2016 to adopt it, and to date only about a third have adopted it. And internationally, it's almost irrelevant. So the IHRA, which is an internet governmental body that has representatives from 31 member states, formally adopted the definition, I think, around 2016. But actually, to date, only 6 of those member countries have themselves adopted the definition, including the UK. And across the world, only 8 countries have adopted it. And this, by the way, information was very easily accessible and available to journalists at the time. It was included in a published fact sheet that the IHRA put out in April 2018, just at the start of this brewing controversy. But what's interesting, if you look at the coverage of this issue, is how this narrative, perpetuated by the same credible, authoritative, established senior Labour MPs that I referenced earlier, becomes completely about how the IHRA definition is consensual, it has unanimous support, it's adopted by everyone, virtually every country in the world, except for the Labour Party, which did, by the way, adopt it. And here's a perfect example of how this actually manifests in a typical BBC piece.
To stifle freedom of speech by invoking the IHRA definition. Okay. I don't think the authors of the definition intended that.
No, what they do say, what the IHRA does say is adding or removing language undermines the months of international diplomacy and academic rigour that led to this definition, which has been adopted by 31 countries.
I haven't seen that quote from the IHRA. I have seen that quote from some members of the UK delegation to the IHRA. But what I can say is that the author of that definition started out with, not with the IHRA, but with the EU body called the EU Monitoring Committee Against Racism. He himself has warned against the simple adoption of this code without any caveats, and he himself has warned about the possible threat to freedom of speech from it.
Stephen Kelly, what is wrong with that being a caveat to make it absolutely clear that it's not anti-Semitic to criticise Israel?
I think what's wrong with it is it's up to the Jewish community to define what anti-Semitism means. We have an IHRA definition which has been accepted by more or less every country in the world, by the Golden Administration, even by our own Constitution Service. So I think that definition is the right one to go with. But there's also, of course, a political dimension to this, which is, as soon as you look at what's coming on.
What you can see happening here is Victoria Derbyshire quotes from a source which she claims to be the IHRA itself, which says that 31 countries, that is the 31 countries of the IHRA, have adopted this definition. Now, as was correctly pointed out, that didn't actually come from the IHRA itself. It came from the UK delegation to the IHRA. And as I said before, the information from the IHRA is that only 8 countries in the world, including 6 of the member states of the IHRA, had adopted this definition. So the first falsehood is actually uttered by, unwittingly, by Victoria Derbyshire herself, claiming A, that this was sourced from the IHRA, this information, and B, that 31 countries have adopted it. But then we move to a Labour MP who makes the claim that every country in the world has adopted it and is not a challenge. And indeed, this becomes repeated. So Andrew Neil, on more than one occasion in Daily Politics, asserts that almost everyone, or virtually every country in the world, has adopted the definition. John Humphreys, on Radio 4 Today programme, every country in the world has adopted it. The other thing to say here is that this was not just to do with deference to sources, but journalists were wedded to particular ways of critiquing Tory and Labour policies. This is, again, rooted in decades of the liberal consensus framework, according to which critique of Tory policies has to be based on a conception of them being neglectful of public services, neglectful of the disadvantaged, the whole kind of nasty party rhetoric, whilst critique of Labour policies is routinely framed as Labour being irresponsible with the public purse or even recklessly idealist, each position understood by implicit reference to the opposing other. So let me give you an example of how this really became disrupted in the election. If we cast our minds back to 2017, you'll see this framing. You'll remember this framing was quite routine, right? So we've got a recurring headline about the dementia tax. Even the right-wing press were up in arms about this, right? This was a classic kind of nasty party narrative, whereas Labour was continually attacked that their spending plans were completely unrealistic and they hadn't costed their manifesto, which they had, and all the rest of it. Now, one of the most bizarre and little acknowledged features of the 2019 election is that, according to the IFS, no less, the Tory manifesto pretty much matched Labour's 2017 spending pledges. Yet even before the manifestos were published, the Conservatives were pumping out a fake news narrative based on Labour's 2017 spending pledges that they were about to match, claiming it would result in pushing national debt into the trillions. What's most astonishing about this is that the Tories' 2019 manifesto not only matched Labour's 2017 spending, but this was almost entirely to be funded by additional borrowing because of the triple lock on tax. So this literally ripped up the Tory rulebook on economic policy and flew in the face of any notion of fiscal responsibility. If Dominic Cummings really is the master political strategist he's made out to be, then I would suggest this was really his genius move. It had nothing to do with Brexit slogans. It was in preempting the only kind of media scrutiny of Tory manifestos that traditionally has any stick or traction in news narratives. Not only was this bizarre and self-contradictory turnaround in Tory's fiscal position barely noted in the television coverage, but true to historical precedent, the overwhelming critical focus was on Labour's spending plans. We saw this most vividly in attention to the IFS response to the manifestos. Typically, the IFS offers an immediate, critical response to both the major party manifestos in terms of their fiscal responsibility. Yet, criticism of the Tory manifesto barely received a mention, IFS criticism, whereas it dominated coverage of the Labour manifesto. In fact, the IFS was 10 times more likely to be mentioned in discussion of Labour manifesto than Tory manifesto. That's on the BBC. Final problem I want to address is another particularly distorted way in which this doctrine of impartiality is routinely interpreted and applied by journalists. One of the most salient issues of this particular election was trust, disinformation and fake news. But from the outset, the Tories very cleverly used fake news to attack fake news. It started with the infamous fake Twitter handle adopted during the first televised debate that attempted to rebrand the Tories as a fact-checking source. By the end of the campaign, we got the fake news story that attempted to discredit the true story about a sick child forced to lie on a hospital floor as fake news. coupled with an aggressive assault on what the Tories claimed was an anti-conservative bias in television news, especially Channel 4, and reinforced by howls of BBC Tory bias in the right-wing press, BBC Labour bias, all of this served to condition broadcasters to treat the issue of trust in political parties very carefully and in a way that is balanced to the extreme. Virtually all the evidence of disinformation in this election put out by political parties was traced to campaign messages by the Tories and secondarily the Lib Dems. According to First Draft, 90% of Tory online adverts were based on claims that are proven to be false. This compared to 7% of Labour's. There was just no comparison, let alone equivalence, in the deliberate spreading of falsehood by the major campaigns. And yet when this issue was covered by the BBC, and I won't bother with the final clip, but it's presented as this is a problem associated equally with all the major parties. And that is the conditioning effect of impartiality. The BBC is so scared to be called out as favouring the Tories that even when the evidence overwhelmingly favours Labour, they cannot actually say it for what it is. In sum, the major democratic deficit in our media system is not the right-wing press, nor is it the phenomenon of fake news attributed to either political parties or online non-professional news and information sources. The major problem is the way in which disinformation is often amplified by the very trusted and credible news organisations like BBC, like even Channel 4, that position themselves as the antidote to disinformation. And at the root of this lies a fundamental skew in the way in which professional journalists have historically and routinely applied the doctrine of impartiality, according to which the extreme centre is instinctively perceived as the centre of gravity around which journalists must achieve balance.
We've got about 10 minutes, so questions, or if you've got any contributions, but questions, keep them brief. Definitely contributions very brief. Yep, one here and one at back. Say who you are, please.
My name is Tony Burke, Assistant General Secretary of Unite, and I just want to comment on the presentation on the polling that you did at Loughborough. Similar polling has been carried out by the TUC directly after the general election, and whilst there's a lot of bad news, the good news is, and it's worth pointing this out at this meeting, Granville, is that on Labour workers' rights issues, the polling of people who switched from Labour to Conservative, very, very positive on banning 0 hours contracts, on workers' rights in the workplace, on living wage, and a number of other things. And at the moment, that's starting to come out. But I don't think we can lose sight of the fact that whilst a lot of the polling was bad, but on workers' rights, it's actually quite good for us.
Okay, there's a question there.
Sorry. My name's Tyler Champion from Preston.
Yeah.
I complained to the BBC when I complained to the BBC when they were referring to the IHRA definition as globally accepted. When they came back, they said it's not an issue, it's global, even though there's 193 countries in the United Nations. How do we escalate issues like that to the next stage so it gets addressed?
Wait a minute, we're going to take one or two more. Is it a question or contribution?
Question.
Yeah.
You mentioned about Corbyn getting a lot of terrible coverage, which he did, but Ken Livingstone did years ago, London GLC and all that lot. And isn't the difference? Look at what Ken, he got thrown out of Labour, won as an independent for Labour Mayor, despite huge London Mayor, despite huge press coverage. Isn't the difference that Ken Livingstone answers his critics and wins people round, and Jeremy Corbyn prefers not to discuss personal attacks and then threw him to the wolves over anti-Semitism. So isn't it how you respond? You get media bias. Ken won people round, Jeremy didn't.
Okay, so two questions there to come back to. One more, and then we're going to take some responses. Yes, there at the back. Who are you?
Sorry?
Who are you?
My name's Nigel Catling. My name's Nigel Catling. I'm a member of the Public and Commercial Services Trade Union. I've just recently got a book from a charity bookshop called regarding Harold Wilson and smear tactics against Harold Wilson while he was Prime Minister, during his time as Prime Minister. And it goes on about the role of the security services, the MI5, MI6, in putting out, undermining Harold Wilson at the time, using smear tactics, this book. I'm just wondering whether, I think you did mention about the deep state, MI5, MI6, when you mentioned that. Is there any evidence that they had a role to play in undermining Jeremy's while it was, is there any evidence about that?
Okay, thank you. Who wants to respond? Well, I'll brief it.
Yeah, Justin, I mean, interesting, Tony, you said about 0 hours
I think you need to speak up to get to the...
Yeah, sure. You mentioned 0 hours contracts. This is a big issue, of course. And in our work, it was one of those things that was marginalised, again, arguably because the agenda is very much skewed towards an older audience, and implicit, and it relates to Justin's comments about this. The labour contractual issue, employment law, was very low down, and yet it obviously is a issue that's going to be likely affected significantly by Brexit and the aftermath.
Thanks. I'll just respond to those three great questions as quickly as I can. Firstly, in regards to BBC accountability, I sympathise entirely. In many ways, the BBC's failure of accountability for these kinds of systemic problems is worse than the problems themselves. The number of complaints that have progressed through the BBC complaints framework and even ended up in Ofcom that have simply been dismissed out of hand, despite overwhelming evidence, is quite astonishing, actually. I should give a plug to a legal action that I have launched, which is challenging Ofcom's decision to dismiss the decision not to even investigate BBC's Panorama edition is Labour anti-Semitic, which was actually even more extreme in terms of its complete breakdown of journalistic values compared to the examples I cited. And there is a crowdfund campaign for that. If anyone wants more information, you're welcome to speak to me. In regards to the question about Labour's communications and responses to these kinds of scandals, I completely hear what you're saying, and I think that there is valid and legitimate critique about some of the positions that were adopted by the leadership in response to, for example, allegations of anti-Semitism. There's only two things I would say. Firstly, the nature of the anti-Semitism scandal is that it is an incredibly difficult issue to offer any kind of defensive response to, because any kind of defensive response is, just by the nature of the issues, easily framed as being part of the problem. And I think that's why the Labour leadership, rightly or wrongly, had a track record of treading very, very carefully in how it responded to those sorts of allegations. And I agree, in some cases, probably not as robust as it should have done. I think if you look at the example of what's happening in the US with the Bernie Sanders campaign, unbelievably a Jewish Brooklyn lifelong anti-racist now being tarred with exactly the same sorts of allegations, he is being much more robust in his defence, but in a way he can do that because he's Jewish. So it's a very difficult area. But I agree, a lot could possibly be learned. The bigger picture, though, of course, is notwithstanding any weaknesses in Labour's communications and responses, this is a problem that is systemic within the media that needs to be addressed for its own self. And finally, in regards to your point about the deep state, well, yes, there is quite unprecedented evidence of involvement of the security service in particular in fomenting some of these negative stories. I referenced the study by Declassified UK, which I would highly recommend. But of course, we also have the Integrity Initiative. This is a Foreign Office funded initiative that was pumping out tweets and amplifying stories that were trying to associate Corbyn as a Soviet stooge.
My name's John Barouche. I'm from Bradford. I'm a member of Unite, and I've been active in politics for many years. But what have we learned? 96 years ago, in 1923, we had a Labour election stolen by the Linoleum letter and all sorts of things in very similar circumstances in all sorts of ways. Are we going to be here in 96 years' time having the same meeting?
George Pope, also from Bradford. George Pope, also from Bradford. I'm making the same point actually, because one of my early memories was going to the Granville picket line and coming home and seeing the news where the pickets were described as trade unionists and other extremists. So my question was, we've been here before, what's new? But the key question is, what do we do about it?
Well, I think, the rest of the day, particularly the last session, is focused specifically on media reform issues, so perhaps I'll defer to that session.
Yeah, I mentioned Zinoviev. It's quite interesting. I did some research on this quite recently, hoping to say something more about it. That was a story 3 or 4 days before the election in 1924. It was picked up by other newspapers, and actually interesting, the Daily Herald rebutted it at the time. But obviously what it played on was a long-standing narrative around the then MacDonald government that it was communist influenced and this kind of thing, the Red Scare as it were. And I think it's the build-up, and you were referring to this in 2018, the build-up of stories about Corbyn. It's difficult sometimes for an opposition party to get a hearing at all, but when it's obviously having to challenge what is a pre-existing narrative, a very strongly argued and articulated concern about the political party, it very much gets in the way. And I think the lesson is it's often not just like the final week, it's a long-term problem over several months, if not years.
Okay. You must tell people what the Zinoviev letter was. It was invented by Churchill, it came from the MI5, and it came a week before the election, and it was a total lie, and totally made up by Churchill, who was then head of the office.
Okay, thank you. Look, we've got to move on to the second session. I'm aware of time. I want to thank, we got off to a great start. I want to thank Dominic and Justin for their contributions and move on to the second session on the